I was like, there's no way. And I will go through it all because considering what's already come out, there's no telling how many dumb things is in there. I saw this and I just shook my head. I couldn't believe it. So now, Nafisa Collier and Nneka Ogwumike are now channeling Caitlin Clark. Oh, when all else fails and we're not getting enough love, we'll try to pull the Caitlin Clark card. Except, it certainly sounds to me like they disagree with Caitlin Clark.
That reaction you just heard is the sound of disbelief setting in. It's the sound people make when they realize they're watching something fall apart in real time, with no breaks and no escape. What you're about to hear isn't just another spicy quote or social media-ready soundbite. It's a statement so disconnected from financial reality that it may end up defining and possibly derailing the most important season the WNBA has ever had. Not next year, not someday, right now. At the exact moment the league finally found momentum, attention, and credibility, one comment managed to put all of it at risk. Because this wasn't a random throwaway line. It came during live contract negotiations, with a deadline looming and real consequences on the table. A time when words aren't symbolic, they're weapons. A time when every public statement either builds trust or burns it. And this one didn't just burn trust, it exposed a dangerous misunderstanding about money, leverage, and how professional sports actually survive. The kind of misunderstanding that can turn a breakthrough moment into a cautionary tale almost overnight. What makes this even more volatile is the timing. The WNBA just came off the most visible, most talked about season in its history. Attendance surged, viewership exploded, sponsors finally leaned in. And at the center of that surge was one player who changed the entire equation: Caitlin Clark. She didn't just bring talent, she brought eyeballs, casual fans, corporate interest, and something this league has chased for decades: real momentum. The kind of momentum you protect at all costs, the kind you don't gamble with during fragile negotiations. And yet, right as that momentum needed patience, alignment, and strategy, a single metaphor detonated into the conversation, comparing claims of league losses to holding the keys to a brand new Ferrari. A line that sounded powerful on the surface, but collapses the moment you think about it. Because that Ferrari comment didn't call out greed, it didn't expose hidden profits. What it actually revealed was something far more unsettling: a fundamental confusion about where the money comes from, who carries the risk, and who truly holds leverage. And once that confusion went public, there was no putting it back in the bottle. Midnight didn't arrive quietly. It wasn't symbolic, and it wasn't flexible. When the clock struck January 14, 2025, the collective bargaining agreement deadline officially expired, and with it went the illusion that there was plenty of time to figure things out later. This wasn't one of those soft deadlines leagues like to float publicly while hammering out deals behind closed doors. This one was real, legally binding, the kind that forces everyone to show their hand. And when that moment passed, there was no handshake, no extension, no "we're close" announcement to calm the room. Just silence, the most dangerous sound in professional sports negotiations. On one side of the table sat the league and its owners, staring at balance sheets, long-term sustainability concerns, and years of accumulated losses. On the other sat the Players Association, demanding structural changes that assumed the league had already crossed into profitability. The problem wasn't that both sides wanted better outcomes. The problem was that they weren't even operating in the same economic reality. The gap between them wasn't about percentages or technical language anymore. It was philosophical. It was about how each side understood the business they were supposedly building together. And that gap only widened as the deadline approached and finally passed. For the first time in decades, the entire future of the WNBA wasn't being debated in theory, it was being tested in real time. This wasn't happening during a down year or a rebuilding phase. It was happening at the exact moment when the league had leverage with fans, broadcasters, and sponsors. That's what made the missed deadline feel so ominous. When negotiations collapse at your lowest point, you can survive it. When they collapse at your highest point, the fall is far steeper. That's why executives, media partners, and even players quietly watching from the sidelines knew this wasn't just another labor dispute. This one carried real risk. And make no mistake, deadlines like this change behavior. Once the window closes, positions harden, public language sharpens, trust erodes quickly. What could have been solved with compromise turns into a staring contest fueled by pride, public pressure, and miscalculated leverage. Behind the scenes, conversations shifted from "how do we fix this" to "who blinks first?" And in labor negotiations, that's the moment where outcomes stop being negotiated and start being imposed by reality. The clock wasn't just marking time anymore. It was exposing exactly how unprepared everyone was for what happens when patience runs out. What makes this deadline even more unforgiving is there's no clean reset button. Games don't magically reschedule themselves, media partners don't wait forever, fans don't stay emotionally invested when uncertainty drags on. Every day past that deadline creates ripple effects that compound quietly before exploding publicly. That's why this moment mattered so much, not because it guaranteed disaster, but because it created the conditions where a single bad argument, one poorly framed idea could push everything off the rails. And unfortunately, that argument was already loaded and waiting to be fired. The moment the Ferrari comment landed, you could almost hear the air leave the room, not because it was emotional or even aggressive, but because it instantly changed the nature of the conversation. Up until that point, negotiations, tense as they were, still lived in the realm of numbers, timing, and future planning. One sentence turned all of that into something else entirely. It reframed the standoff as a moral confrontation instead of a financial one, and once that happens, compromise becomes almost impossible.
When Nneka Ogwumike sat down for an ESPN interview and delivered the line comparing claims of league losses to holding the keys to a brand new Ferrari, it didn't come across as off the cuff. It sounded deliberate, confident, like a mic drop moment meant to rally support and draw a clear line in the sand. The implication was obvious and sharp. If owners are wealthy enough to afford luxury lifestyles, then claims of financial struggle must be exaggerated, if not outright dishonest. And that implication landed at the worst possible time. Because that metaphor didn't just criticize negotiation positions, it questioned credibility. It suggested that owners were hiding money, crying poor while sitting comfortably behind closed doors. In the world of labor talks, that's not pressure, that's an accusation, and accusations harden defenses fast. The conversation was no longer about future revenue, growth timelines, or sustainability models. It became about trust and whether one side believed the other was acting in good faith at all. What made the reaction so intense wasn't just who the comment targeted, but how broadly it painted the picture. The Ferrari wasn't about one individual, it symbolized ownership as a whole. The jets, the estates, the visible wealth, all rolled into a single image meant to invalidate claims of loss. That framing played well to emotion, but it quietly ignored the most important detail in sports economics. Personal wealth and league profitability are not interchangeable. That distinction may seem technical, but ignoring it is how negotiations derail. Inside ownership circles, the message was received loud and clear. This wasn't a call for discussion or clarification. It was a public challenge to the legitimacy of their financial disclosures. And when you challenge the integrity of the people writing the checks, you're no longer negotiating terms. You're daring them to stop writing those checks altogether. That's why insiders immediately recognized this as an inflection point, not because the comment was rude, but because it crossed an invisible line that negotiations rarely survive. And perhaps most damaging of all, the Ferrari quote forced everyone else to pick sides prematurely. Media narratives polarized, fans argued past each other, social feeds amplified outrage instead of nuance. Meanwhile, the actual mechanics of the deal, the numbers that matter, were getting buried under a metaphor that felt good but solved nothing. The irony is that in trying to apply pressure, the comments stripped away leverage instead. It moved the debate away from where progress happens and into territory where pride, optics, and ego start driving decisions. That's why this wasn't just another viral line. It was a turning point. It shifted negotiations from delicate to volatile in seconds. And once that door swung open, there was no way to quietly walk it back. The Ferrari was out there now, parked squarely in the middle of talks that were already hanging by a thread. And what came next would expose just how fragile that thread really was. This is where the entire Ferrari argument collapses under its own weight. Because the assumption baked into that metaphor is simple but fatally flawed. If owners are wealthy, then the league must be profitable. And that assumption ignores how business actually works. Wealth doesn't magically transfer between separate enterprises just because they share the same owner. A billionaire owning a losing business doesn't make that business profitable. It means the owner is absorbing the losses. And that distinction is everything. Take Mark Davis, often cited as the perfect example in these conversations. Yes, he's wealthy. Yes, he lives a lifestyle that signals financial success. But that money didn't come from the Las Vegas Aces. It came from the Raiders, an NFL franchise operating in a league that prints money through massive TV deals, sponsorships, and revenue sharing. The Aces are not the engine behind that wealth. They're a separate entity entirely. When the WNBA loses money, that loss doesn't disappear. It gets covered, personally, out of pocket. The same logic applies to Joe Tsai. His net worth wasn't built in women's basketball. It came from building one of the largest tech companies on the planet. Pointing to his success outside the WNBA and using it as proof that the league is financially healthy is like pointing at a skyscraper across town and claiming your house can't be flooding because someone else is rich. The two things are not connected in the way the Ferrari argument suggests they are. This misunderstanding is what economists and investors would immediately recognize as a category error, confusing the financial health of an owner with the financial health of the asset they own. Sports leagues don't operate on vibes, optics, or Instagram glimpses of wealth. They operate on balance sheets, revenue in, expenses out. When expenses consistently exceed revenue, that gap has to be covered somehow. In the WNBA's case, that gap has been covered for decades by ownership groups willing to subsidize losses in the belief that long-term growth was possible.
And that's the part that keeps getting lost. These owners aren't extracting profit and hiding it somewhere offshore. They're doing the opposite. They've been injecting capital year after year to keep the league alive long enough for a moment like this. The moment when attention finally spiked and fans finally showed up. A Ferrari in a parking lot doesn't signal greed, it signals capacity. The capacity to keep funding something that hasn't yet paid them back. Once you understand that, the tone of the negotiation shifts dramatically, because demanding higher salaries or revenue sharing based on owner wealth isn't leverage. It's a misunderstanding of the deal you're sitting in. Labor negotiations are always tied to the performance of the business being negotiated over, not the side ventures of the people who own it. That's why the Ferrari metaphor didn't expose hypocrisy, it exposed confusion. And in negotiations this fragile, confusion is more dangerous than bad faith, because it leads one side to believe money exists where it simply doesn't. That's the reality sitting under all of this tension. The WNBA isn't a cash machine hiding behind rich faces. It's a developing business that has survived precisely because wealthy owners chose to tolerate losses in pursuit of growth. And when that reality gets ignored, every demand, no matter how emotionally compelling, starts to drift further away from what the numbers can actually support. Here's the part of this conversation that almost never makes it into highlight clips or viral debates because it's uncomfortable and it kills the narrative. For nearly 3 decades, the WNBA has not been a self-sustaining business. That's not a hot take, that's not speculation, that's the documented financial reality. Season after season, ownership groups have stepped in to cover operating losses, writing checks not because the league was thriving, but because they believed or hoped that growth would eventually arrive. And those losses aren't small, they're not rounding errors. Reports from recent seasons estimate the league operating roughly $40 million in the red. That number matters because it resets the entire conversation. When a business loses that kind of money annually, there is no surplus to divide, no hidden vault waiting to be unlocked, no secret payday being withheld. There's just math, and math doesn't respond to pressure campaigns or moral arguments. It responds only to revenue. This is where the Ferrari imagery becomes actively misleading. When an owner shows up wealthy, it doesn't mean the league is quietly profitable. It means that owner is absorbing losses personally to keep the operation alive, covering payroll, covering travel, covering marketing, covering infrastructure. That luxury car isn't evidence of exploitation. It's evidence that without outside money, the lights would have gone out a long time ago. The league has survived because people with deep pockets were willing to lose money publicly while being criticized privately. What's rarely acknowledged is that patience like that has limits. Subsidization is not infinite goodwill, it's a calculated risk. Owners tolerate losses as long as there's a credible path to sustainability. And for the first time in the league's history, that path finally started to appear. Ratings jumped, attendance spiked, sponsors leaned in, media coverage exploded. But those changes didn't instantly erase decades of red ink. They didn't flip the balance sheet overnight. Momentum is not the same thing as profit, and confusing the two is how progress gets derailed. That's why this moment is so fragile. The WNBA isn't standing on a mountain of cash, it's standing on optimism, on projections, on the belief that recent growth can be converted into consistent revenue if, and this part matters, the games continue to be played and the audience continues to show up. Interrupt that flow and the entire financial model starts to wobble again. The losses don't disappear during a shutdown, they multiply. Saying this out loud makes people uncomfortable because it clashes with the feel-good narrative, but ignoring it doesn't make it any less true. The WNBA's financial reality isn't one of hidden riches being hoarded, it's one of long-term investment finally beginning to show signs of life. And when negotiations pretend that life already equals profit, they stop being grounded in reality. That disconnect is exactly why this fight has escalated so quickly, because one side is negotiating with future hope, while the other is still staring at present losses. This is where timing becomes everything, because on paper, revenue sharing sounds reasonable. In fact, in a healthy, profitable league, it's not just reasonable, it's expected. The problem is that revenue sharing assumes something critical already exists: profits. And right now, that assumption is doing far more damage than people realize. Pushing for a large percentage of gross revenue when a business is still operating at a loss isn't just aggressive negotiation, it's a strategic misfire.
When proposals start floating numbers like 30% of gross revenue, they sound bold and empowering. But gross revenue is not profit. It's the top line, not the bottom line. Before a single dollar can be shared, that money has to cover expenses, salaries, travel, arena costs, marketing, staffing, operations, and infrastructure. When those expenses already exceed revenue, carving out a bigger slice doesn't create new money, it just deepens the hole. That's not leverage, that's asking an already underwater business to sink faster. Here's a simpler way to look at it. Imagine working at a struggling restaurant that hasn't turned a profit in years. One location, one balance sheet. Now, imagine demanding a raise, not because the restaurant is doing well, but because the owner also happens to run a wildly successful real estate company on the side. That extra money doesn't come from the restaurant. The restaurant doesn't care how profitable the owner's other ventures are. Its books don't magically improve because wealth exists somewhere else. The restaurant's reality is the restaurant. That's how labor negotiations work, whether people like it or not. What makes this strategy especially risky is that it ignores how growth actually compounds. New media rights deals, bigger sponsorships, and expanded exposure don't hit all at once. They phase in. They stabilize over time. They require consistency. Right now, the league is at the early edge of that curve. There's promise, sure. Projections look exciting, but projections don't pay invoices. They don't cover payroll. They don't balance books. And negotiating as if projected revenue is guaranteed revenue is how organizations overextend themselves. This approach also quietly hands leverage to the other side. Ownership doesn't need to rush. They're not dependent on WNBA income to survive. The league matters to them strategically and reputationally, but financially, they can wait. Players, on the other hand, rely on games being played. They rely on visibility. They rely on season continuity to maintain endorsements, brand relevance, and future earning power. Demanding immediate revenue sharing before profits exist flips that leverage dynamic against the very people making the demands. None of this means players shouldn't fight for better compensation. They should. The issue is sequencing. Growth first, stability second, power last. Skipping steps doesn't accelerate progress, it fractures it. And when negotiations treat hypothetical future revenue as cash already sitting on the table, they create expectations that reality can't meet. That's how talks stall, that's how trust erodes, and that's how a breakthrough moment turns into a self-inflicted setback. What made this situation even more unstable wasn't just what was being said publicly, it was who was saying what and when. Inside the union leadership, the messaging wasn't unified, and in high-stakes negotiations, mixed signals are a flashing warning sign. Because leverage isn't just about numbers, it's about credibility. And credibility collapses the moment the other side realizes you're not speaking with one voice. Shortly before the Ferrari comment went viral, Breanna Stewart gave an interview that struck a very different tone. Calm, measured, cautiously optimistic. She talked about progress, ongoing dialogue, and the belief that negotiations could continue without blowing everything up. There was no accusation, no provocation, just the kind of language that signals flexibility, the kind owners expect to hear when both sides still believe a deal is possible. Then the ESPN interview dropped, and suddenly the tone shifted from collaboration to confrontation. The Ferrari line didn't just challenge financial claims, it questioned honesty, it implied deception, it suggested that ownership wasn't just misaligned, but misleading. Those are two completely different narratives coming from the same union leadership circle. One says, "We're working through this," the other says, "You're lying to us." You cannot successfully negotiate while broadcasting both messages at the same time. From an ownership perspective, that inconsistency is destabilizing. If one leader hints at compromise while another publicly escalates, it raises a critical question: who actually speaks for the union? And if that question isn't clear, trust disappears fast. Negotiations rely on predictability. Knowing what's said privately won't be undermined publicly hours later. Once that confidence is gone, every conversation becomes defensive, every offer comes with hesitation, every concession feels risky. This is where the dispute quietly crossed a line. When union leadership publicly questions the financial integrity of the people funding the league, it stops being bargaining and starts becoming theater. At that point, owners aren't calculating percentages anymore. They're recalculating risk. They're asking whether continued investment is worth being painted as villains, regardless of reality. And that internal math doesn't favor escalation.
What makes this particularly damaging is that the players themselves are not a monolith. Many rely on game checks to survive. Many depend on season continuity to maintain sponsorships and off-season income. Mixed messaging at the top doesn't just confuse ownership, it leaves rank-and-file players exposed to consequences they didn't choose. When leadership sends contradictory signals, it's usually the people with the least financial cushion who absorb the fallout. In negotiation terms, this is how momentum dies. Not with one explosive demand, but with inconsistent leadership that signals uncertainty. One path suggested patience and progress. The other chose accusation and pressure, and once both paths were visible at the same time, the union's position weakened, not because the goals were wrong, but because the execution fractured. In moments like this, unity isn't optional, it's leverage, and right now, that leverage is slipping. What makes this moment so striking is that the clearest understanding of leverage isn't coming from a boardroom or a negotiation table, it's coming from a rookie who just arrived. Caitlin Clark hasn't been issuing demands or posturing in interviews. She hasn't threatened work stoppages or taken rhetorical swings. Instead, she's been doing something far more powerful and far less visible. She's been building the business in real time. And in doing so, she's quietly demonstrated a grasp of timing that many seasoned negotiators seem to be missing. Clark didn't just bring skill to the court, she brought relevance. She brought casual fans who had never watched a WNBA game before. She brought sellouts, record ratings, social media traffic, sponsor interest, and non-stop media attention. This wasn't incremental growth, it was an inflection point, the kind leagues spend decades hoping for and often never get. The breakthrough wasn't guaranteed, it had to be nurtured, protected, allowed to compound. And that's what makes timing so central to everything happening right now. While others are focused on extracting immediate value, Clark is operating as if she understands that value has to exist before it can be divided. Her message has been simple and unglamorous. Play the games, keep the doors open, protect the momentum, let the audience come back again and again until attention turns into habit and habit turns into revenue. That's not weakness, that's long-term thinking. It's recognizing that leverage grows when you become indispensable, when the league can't imagine operating without you because the numbers prove your impact. This is the uncomfortable contrast at the heart of the dispute. On one side, there's a push to cash in at the peak of excitement. On the other, there's an understanding that excitement is not yet infrastructure. The fans Clark brought need consistency. Broadcasters need reliability. Sponsors need assurance that the product will be there week after week. Disrupt that flow, and the momentum she created doesn't pause, it evaporates. You don't get to simply restart cultural relevance once it's lost. Timing isn't about surrendering leverage, it's about maximizing it. Clark's approach suggests an awareness that the strongest negotiating position doesn't come from threatening to stop production, it comes from proving you are the engine of growth. Every game played, every arena filled, every broadcast watched strengthens that position. Every interruption weakens it. That's the leverage curve most people don't talk about because it takes patience and trust in the process. What's remarkable is how quietly this understanding has surfaced. Clark hasn't framed it as strategy. She hasn't needed to. Her actions make the case for her. She's betting that sustained success creates undeniable power, the kind that reshapes future negotiations without blowing up the present. And in a moment where so many voices are racing to grab what they think is available now, she's the rare one signaling that the real opportunity is bigger, if the league survives long enough to reach it. The danger of a work stoppage isn't abstract, and it isn't evenly shared. It's immediate, it's asymmetric, and once the damage is done, much of it can't be undone. The idea that the league could simply pause and then resume where it left off ignores how fragile momentum really is, especially in a league that just fought its way into the public conversation. Sports history is unforgiving on this point. Fans don't wait patiently, they drift. And once they drift, getting them back is far harder than attracting them in the first place. If games don't start on time, the first thing that disappears isn't core fandom. It's the casual audience Caitlin Clark brought in. Those viewers don't have decades of emotional investment holding them in place. They came because something felt new, exciting, and accessible. Take that away, and they move on to the next story. Sponsors follow the audience. Media coverage follows consistency. Without games, all three evaporate quietly, leaving behind a league that looks to outsiders stalled instead of ascending. The financial consequences stack quickly. Missed games mean lost ticket revenue, lost concessions, and lost local sponsorship activations. Broadcasters don't just lose content, they lose confidence. Ad partners reallocate budgets. Momentum-driven deals stall or disappear entirely. And because so much of the league's recent growth is built on forward-looking promise rather than locked-in guarantees, interruption hits harder here than in leagues already stabilized by long-term contracts and massive cash reserves.
For players, the risks are even sharper. A lost season doesn't just mean missed game checks. It means lost endorsement opportunities, diminished visibility, weakened personal brands, and reduced off-season leverage. Younger players lose critical development time.
Veterans lose relevance in a market that moves fast and rarely waits. And for many, especially those without superstar contracts or safety nets, the financial hit isn't theoretical, it's personal and immediate. Meanwhile, ownership can afford patience, not because they're indifferent, but because they're diversified. Their lifestyles don't hinge on WNBA revenue. Their broader portfolios can absorb a dormant season in ways player careers cannot. That imbalance is the unspoken reality of leverage in this dispute. Waiting favors the side with options. Playing favors the side whose value compounds through visibility. And right now, a stoppage hands the advantage to the very people being challenged. This is why the Ferrari argument is so dangerous when translated into real-world consequences. It frames wealth as power, while ignoring time as power. The league needs continuity far more than it needs confrontation. Every missed tip-off weakens the breakthrough moment that was finally within reach. And once momentum is broken, it doesn't ask for permission to disappear. It simply does, leaving everyone to deal with consequences that no metaphor can soften or reverse. This is the crossroads the league didn't expect to be standing at so soon. Not because success arrived, but because it arrived faster than the structures around it were ready to handle. The Ferrari argument wasn't just a bad metaphor or a clumsy soundbite. It became a symbol of a deeper disconnect about money, about leverage, and about how fragile progress really is when it's mistaken for permanence. One side is negotiating as if the destination has already been reached. The other is still staring at the map, trying to make sure the road doesn't collapse before anyone gets there. At the center of that tension is a simple but uncomfortable truth. Power in sports doesn't come from threatening to stop the product. It comes from proving the product is indispensable. You don't build leverage by pulling value out of a system before it exists. You build it by creating so much value that the system can't function without you. That's the difference between short-term pressure and long-term strength, and it's the difference that defines whether leagues grow or fracture at their peak. That's why the quiet contrast in this story matters so much. While leadership voices argue timing and demand immediate returns, Caitlin Clark has been showing what real leverage looks like, not through threats, not through metaphors, but through packed arenas, record ratings, and attention that finally translates into opportunity. Her approach isn't about giving anything up. It's about understanding sequence, that growth comes first, sustainability second, and negotiating power last. Reverse that order, and everything built on top of it becomes unstable. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding reality, about recognizing that momentum is easier to lose than to rebuild, and that leagues don't collapse because players ask for too much. They collapse because timing, math, and trust stop aligning. The WNBA is closer to a real breakthrough than it's ever been, but that also means it's closer to a self-inflicted setback than anyone wants to admit. The choice facing the league right now will echo for years. Protect the moment, let the audience turn into habits, let habits turn into revenue, and then fight over how to split something real. Or rush the process, gamble on leverage that doesn't yet exist, and risk watching the first true wave of mainstream success quietly recede. One path builds lasting power. The other leaves everyone asking how so much promise slipped away at the exact moment it finally arrived.